Welcome to the History Maps podcast. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake rolling through a major modern city is, well, it's a highly destructive event. The ground literally acts like ocean waves.
Right, and if you're standing inside a modern brick building, especially one without heavily reinforced steel, the walls will crack in seconds.
Because the mortar holding those bricks together just shatters.
Exactly. The rigidity of the structure is its own downfall. It tries to fight the movement.
But if you take a classical Greek temple built 2.5 millennia ago, it's a completely different story. I mean, we're talking about structures built entirely of multi-ton, unglued stones, just resting directly on top of each other. And when the earth heaves, it doesn't break.
No, it doesn't. The temple actually dances.
Which is such a wild visual.
It is, but it's because the structure is actively engineered to move. A Greek temple survives a seismic event by, dissipating the energy of the earthquake through friction, rather than trying to rigidly fight the ground.
And that brings us to the focus of today's deep dive. We are looking closely at ancient Greek architecture, spanning roughly from 900 BCE down to the 1st century BCE.
And our mission here is to completely strip away that romanticized post-Renaissance myth.
Right, the idea of the quiet, pristine white ruin just sitting silently on a hill in Athens.
Yeah, that image is totally incomplete. When you look at the architectural schematics, the modern seismic data, and the chemical pigment analysis, you realize these structures were massive, highly calculated, aggressively functional machines.
They weren't just pretty art projects.
Not at all. To truly grasp what these builders were doing, you can't separate the art from the science. Every single visual element present on a classical Greek temple or even a private home served a distinct functional, structural, or civic purpose.
So the physical environment dictated the engineering, and the engineering dictated the aesthetic. And just so you know, the sources compiled for this discussion are extensive. We're drawing from historical construction records, detailed architectural analyses, specific seismic studies from the late 20th century, and deep chemical research into ancient pigments.
We really want to look past the iconic columns, to understand how these builders operated. And they did it without modern mortar, without the structural arches we rely on today, and obviously without motorized transport.
So where do we start?
I mean, the logical place to begin is the ground itself. Before examining a finished temple or a grand civic grid, you really have to understand the physical environment. Ancient Greek architecture was basically forged by a profoundly unyielding geography.
Unyielding is a good word for it. If you look at a map of the region, the terrain is essentially shattered rock and water.
Yeah, you have the heavily mountainous mainland, completely fractured by deep valleys, and then just a spray of hundreds of islands across the Aegean Sea.
And that specific topography must have dictated their entire supply chain, right?
It absolutely did. Because of those steep mountain passes and isolated island communities, large-scale overland transport of heavy building materials was basically a logistical impossibility.
Too expensive and too slow.
Prohibitively so. The geography trapped these communities. So if a city-state wanted to build something monumental, they had to become masters of the hyperlocal materials.
Meaning they had to pull the stone directly from the ground right beneath their feet.
Exactly, or at least from a quarry situated very, very close to a navigable waterway.
So they're dealing with a heavily localized supply chain by necessity. But they didn't just start building massive stone temples right after the Bronze Age collapse, did they?
No. If you look at the Greek Dark Ages, the construction materials are completely different. Following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BCE, monumental stone architecture essentially vanished from the region.
So what were they building with?
By the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, the standard building materials reverted to sun-dried mud brick and timber.
Okay, mud and wood.
Right. A really crucial example of this transitional period is the settlement at Lefkandi on the island of Euboea. Excavations there uncovered a massive structure over 50 meters long, constructed entirely of mud brick and wood, and it was topped with a high thatched gable roof.
I mean, mud brick and thatch sound exceptionally fragile, especially when you consider the Mediterranean climate. You have those hot, blistering summers, but the winters bring heavy, seasonal driving rains.
And that rain is the primary enemy of mud brick. If a sun-dried mud wall gets soaked, it simply dissolves right back into the earth.
It just melts.
Basically, yeah. So to protect those walls at Lefkandi from melting during the winter storms, the builders engineered a massive overhang. They extended the thatched roof far out beyond the exterior walls.
But thatch and timber are heavy. especially when they're wet.
Exactly. So that deep overhang required vertical support. They solved this by placing a continuous row of wooden posts entirely around the outside perimeter of the building.
Wait, so by trying to keep the rain off a mud wall, they inadvertently created the colonnade.
That's exactly what happened. The defining silhouette of the classical Greek temple, a rectangular central room surrounded by a ring of columns, it was literally born out of rudimentary weatherproofing.
That is fascinating. But wood and mud brick demand constant, endless maintenance. Wood rots, insects destroy it. The mud requires resurfacing.
Plus, over the centuries, Greece experienced significant deforestation. Timber large enough for these massive civic structures became incredibly scarce and extremely expensive to import from places like Macedon or the Near East.
So as these city-states grew in wealth and developed a stronger sense of civic identity, they wanted permanence.
Right, they wanted monuments that wouldn't require constant rebuilding every few generations, so they initiated this slow transition from wood to stone. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, this shift is clearly visible. They initially relied heavily on a material called poros.
Porous is a limestone, right? Very common in Attica and the Cyclades.
Yeah, it's a soft, somewhat porous, yellowish limestone. It was relatively easy to quarry and carve with early iron tools.
But I'm guessing it wasn't strong enough for what they ultimately wanted to build.
Exactly. As their tools and techniques improved, they sought a material that could hold sharper details and bear much heavier loads. And that drive led them directly to marble.
Which is incredibly dense and durable.
Extremely. And capable of holding razor-sharp microscopic details when carved. The white Pentelic marble, which they sourced from Mount Pentelicon near Athens, became the ultimate standard.
What made Pentelic marble so special?
It possesses this fine-grained crystalline texture and a slight translucency. When it's polished, the stone actually absorbs and reflects the bright Mediterranean sunlight, giving it a really luminous quality.
Okay, but that brings up a massive mechanical question for me. You have a mountain of solid, highly dense Pentelic marble. The city wants a temple. How do you extract a block weighing 10 or 20 tons from the bedrock without modern explosives or diamond-tip saws?
It was a highly calculated application of basic physics and biological mechanics. Workers at the quarry face used iron picks and heavy chisels to laboriously carve narrow, deep channels into the bedrock, basically isolating a large rectangular block on 4 sides.
But it's still attached at the bottom.
Right, it's attached at the base. To break it free, they used a technique relying entirely on wood and water.
I was actually reading the sources on this specific technique, and it is brilliant in its simplicity. They carved small, horizontal slots all along the base of that isolated block. Then they took completely dry, tightly grained wooden wedges and hammered them deeply into those slots.
And once those wooden wedges were firmly seated, the workers systematically poured water over them.
Because dry wood absorbs water.
Exactly. The cellular structure of the dry wood absorbs the water and it swells. The expansion of the wood creates a slow, immense, and completely uniform outward pressure along the line of the slots.
And that pressure just snaps the stone.
It cleanly snaps the marble along its natural fault lines. It separates a multi-ton block from the mountain in one piece, without the shattering or microfracturing that explosives would cause.
So they're literally weaponizing the biological properties of wood and the physical properties of water to crack solid stone.
It's ingenious.
But that only gets the block loose. Moving a 10-ton block of marble down a mountain and across a landscape without motorized vehicles or even heavy-duty wheeled carts, that's a completely different problem.
Yeah, and wheeled carts were largely useless for this specific task.
Because of the weight.
The concentrated, localized weight of a massive marble block would instantly crush wooden axles. Or the heavy, narrow wheels would simply sink deep into the dirt tracks, rendering the cart completely immovable.
So what did they do instead?
Well, for a quarry situated on an island like Paros or Naxos, the workers utilized systems of heavy wooden levers, block and tackle pulleys, and massive winches to maneuver the block onto a heavily reinforced wooden sledge.
And to move the sledge, they had to manipulate friction.
They did. They laid down prepared, grooved tracks along the descent. Teams of men, sometimes hundreds of individuals, would haul on thick hemp ropes.
That's a lot of friction, though. Wooden tracks and a wooden sledge with 10 tons on it.
Which is why, to keep the sledge from binding, or literally catching fire from friction, other workers walked ahead, constantly lubricating the wooden tracks with water or low-grade olive oil.
The physical reality of that operation is staggering when you really think about it. Just picture a quarry site in the summer heat. The constant ringing of iron against stone, the groaning of the wooden winches, the coordination required by hundreds of haulers just to keep a 10-ton block from sliding out of control down a slope.
And then loading it onto a specialized, reinforced cargo ship.
Right, then sailing it across the Aegean, unloading it at the port of Piraeus, and dragging it on oiled sledges all the way uphill to the Acropolis.
It was an operation requiring a massive, highly organized, and very specialized labor force. The economic engine driving this was incredibly complex.
Because construction sites weren't manned just by one class of people.
Not at all. You had free citizen artisans who were paid daily wages. Financial records show highly skilled free laborers might earn 1 drachma a day for their work.
And then you had the medics, the resident foreigners.
Yes, the medics. They weren't citizens of the polis, but they were deeply integrated into the economy. They frequently dominated the highly skilled trades, such as precision stone cutting and sculptural relief carving, and they organized into informal guilds to protect their trade secrets.
But a massive portion of the heavy labor fell to enslaved people, didn't it?
It did. Enslaved labor was a foundational pillar of the Greek economy, comprising up to 30% of the population in major centers like Athens. They were heavily utilized in the grueling aspects of construction, the deep quarrying, the hauling, the movement of earth.
But the sources noted something interesting about how they all worked together on the actual sites.
Yeah, if you examine the surviving financial accounts for the construction of the Erechtheion on the Athenian Acropolis, you find this fascinating social integration on the scaffolding.
Really? Like side by side?
Exactly. Free citizens, medics, and enslaved workers frequently operated side by side in integrated teams. They often received the exact same daily compensation rate for the specific piecework they completed.
So the state prioritized the maximum efficiency and quality of the construction above maintaining social segregation on the worksite.
Precisely. They just needed the work done perfectly.
Okay, so moving these massive materials to the site is really just the supply side of the equation. Once you have a staging ground filled with hundreds of rough-cut 10-ton blocks of marble, you need a system to assemble them. You can't just pile them up randomly.
No, you need a reproducible structural language.
And that necessity births what we now call the architectural orders.
Exactly. The orders are the fundamental grammar of classical building. If you comprehend the rules of the orders, you can read the structural logic of any Greek building.
So what exactly is an order, structurally speaking?
An order is a highly codified modular unit of design. It dictates the specific style, the mathematical proportions, and the structural relationship between a vertical supporting column and the horizontal weight it carries.
Which is known as the entablature.
Right, the entablature.
The sources outline 3 primary Greek orders: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Let's break down the mechanics of these, starting with the Doric because it's the oldest and visibly the heaviest.
It originates on the Greek mainland and in the Western colonies, in places like Sicily and southern Italy, around the 7th century BCE.
And the visual impact of the Doric order is just raw, stocky power. The mathematical ratio of the column's diameter to its height is generally around 1 to 5.5, or sometimes 1 to 6.
So it looks deeply planted in the earth. It is visually anchoring the building.
And it achieves that anchored look mechanically, right? Because the Doric column doesn't have a separate base.
Correct. The shaft of the column, which is carved with those vertical concave grooves called flutes, rests directly on the floor of the temple platform.
And the top of the column.
The capital is aggressively functional. It consists of a convex, bulging cushion shape called the echinus, which flares out to support a plain, flat, square block called the abacus.
So the abacus just acts as a wide, stable platform to distribute the immense downward pressure of the stone beams above.
That's its exact job. But the truly defining characteristic of the Doric order is located above the columns, up in the frieze of the entablature. You have this very strict, repeating, alternating pattern of triglyphs and misaliches.
Right, and the Doric entablature is basically a fascinating structural fossil. It's the literal translation of ancient carpentry techniques into solid stone.
Exactly. A triglyph is a rectangular block carved with 3 vertical grooves. Those grooves aren't merely decorative. They visually represent the ends of the old, heavy wooden roof beams that used to rest on top of the walls in earlier structures.
And the metatopes are the flat, square panels situated between those triglyphs.
Right. In a wooden building, the metope was just the empty space between the ceiling beams, which was eventually boarded up with terracotta just to keep out birds and weather.
But in stone, those metope panels became prime real estate for high-relief mythological sculpture.
They did. They maintained the visual language of the wooden structures even after the structural mechanics completely changed with the introduction of marble. They wanted the comfort of the familiar.
Which makes sense. Now, moving eastward to the coast of modern-day Turkey and the Aegean Islands, a different system emerges in the 6th century BCE, the Ionic order.
The Ionic order solves the structural problem differently. It's significantly more slender, with a height-to-diameter ratio closer to 9:1.
That's a huge difference.
It is. Because the shaft is taller and thinner, the architects recognized it needed a wider footprint to distribute its weight safely onto the foundation. Therefore, an Ionic column always stands on a distinct carved base.
And those bases are pretty complex, right?
Very. They usually feature a complex series of convex, rounded moldings known as torus moldings, interspersed with the concave scotia moldings.
And the capital is the immediate visual giveaway. Instead of the simple, heavy square block of the Doric, the Ionic capital features those scroll-like shapes called volutes.
The volutes are structurally intriguing. They unfurl outward from the center of the capital, creating a wider bearing surface for the architrave beam above.
But didn't the volutes create a massive geometric headache for the architects?
Oh, a huge one. Because the volutes give the Ionic capital a specific directional facing. It looks completely different when viewed from the front than it does from the side.
Right, so when they reach the corners of a building.
Exactly. It required them to invent uniquely angled corner capitals so the visual rhythm wouldn't be broken. Furthermore, the Ionic order completely abandons the alternating triglyphs and mesopes in the frieze.
They went with a continuous band instead.
Yes. It utilizes a single continuous flat band of stone, which allowed sculptors to carve unbroken continuous narrative scenes wrapping entirely around the building.
And finally, we have the Corinthian order, which enters the architectural vocabulary a bit later, developing in the 5th century BCE.
Structurally and proportionally, the Corinthian order is nearly identical to the Ionic. It employs the same slender shaft ratios and similar complex bases. The entire distinction rests in the design of the capital.
Which is the one with all the leaves.
Right. The Corinthian capital mimics a woven basket completely overgrown with stylized, deeply carved acanthus leaves and small, curling tendrils. It is incredibly ornate.
I recall the sources mentioning the earliest known physical example of a Corinthian capital is actually hidden away.
It is. It's found hidden in the dark inner sanctum of the Temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bosai, dating to around 430 BCE. The Greeks invented it, but they used it sparingly. It was the Romans, centuries later, who really adopted the Corinthian order as the standard for their massive imperial monuments.
Okay, so we have the modular grammar down. The step foundation is the crebodoma. The top step where the columns rest is the stylobate. We have the columns, and resting upon them is the entablature divided into the architrave beam, the frieze, and the overhanging cornice, all capped by the triangular pediment of the roof.
That's the basic anatomy.
But if construction is just stacking these predefined mathematical blocks, how did the Greek architects avoid creating rigid, boring, lifeless boxes? I mean, a building like the Parthenon does not look like a stiff mathematical grid. It looks incredibly organic.
It does, and that's because the architects understood a fundamental biological flaw.
Which is?
The human eye is imperfect. If you construct a massive sprawling structure with perfectly straight lines, perfectly plumb verticals, and perfect 90-degree right angles, optical illusions will distort it.
How so?
Well, a long, perfectly flat horizontal step, like the stylobate of a temple, will actually appear to the human eye as if it's sagging or dipping in the middle under the immense visual weight of the columns above it.
So to fix a biological optical illusion, they engineered an architectural illusion.
Exactly. They actively avoided perfect geometry. The Parthenon in Athens is the masterclass in this technique, known as optical refinements.
Okay, let's talk about the Parthenon's floor then.
The massive platform the temple sits on is not flat. It curves upward very slightly towards the center, forming an imperceptible dome.
And the columns?
The columns themselves do not stand perfectly straight. They all lean slightly inward toward the center of the building. Calculations show that if you extended the lines of the Parthenon's columns upward into the sky, they would eventually intersect roughly 1.5 miles above the earth.
That is mind-boggling precision. And the columns themselves are not simple cylinders either.
No, they utilize a technique known as entasis. As the column shaft rises from the base, it doesn't taper in a straight conical line. It actually bulges outward very slightly, roughly 1/3 of the way up, before tapering back inward toward the capital.
Why make it bulge like that?
This slight convex swelling mimics the way a biological muscle flexes and bulges when it is bearing a heavy load. It tricks the eye into perceiving the rigid stone as elastic, almost as if the column is actively, muscularly pushing back against the crushing weight of the marble roof.
Okay, let's clarify what that means for the stonemasons on the ground. If the foundation is a dome, and the columns lean inward and the shafts bulge, that means you cannot just cut a standard square block.
You definitely cannot.
The sources mentioned earlier that they cut blocks into parallelepipeds. For those of us who haven't taken high school geometry in a decade, what does that actually look like in a stonemason's hands?
A parallelepiped is a three-dimensional figure formed by 6 parallelograms. In practical masonry terms, it means the block is not a perfect cube or a standard brick shape with 90-degree corners.
Because the floor is curving.
Exactly. Because the floor is curving upward and the columns are leaning inward, the blocks making up the walls and the steps had to be carved with incredibly subtle, skewed angles. They are slightly wedge-shaped.
So every block is unique.
Essentially, yes. The masons had to calculate and carve these massive stones with millimeter precision so that when they were stacked, the complex, skewed geometry locked together perfectly tight. This created the illusion of straight lines while actually forming a subtle, curving, organic shape.
It's a level of geometric control that is difficult to execute, even with modern laser-guided equipment.
It really is.
This highly refined, organically tweaked system found its ultimate expression in the temples. But I think we must redefine what a Greek temple actually was, because it was not a church or a mosque.
No, it was not a place for a congregation to gather inside for communal worship.
So what was its primary function?
The Greek word for temple is naos, which literally translates to dwelling or house. The building was designed strictly as the physical residence for the deity on earth. The central primary function of the architecture was to shelter and protect the cult statue of the god or goddess.
Where did the actual worship happen then?
The actual religious rituals, the massive communal gatherings, the processions, and the animal sacrifices took place entirely outside. They occurred around a large open-air altar situated in the broader sacred precinct known as the temenos.
So the interior of the building is highly exclusive, restricted space.
Extremely restricted. The floor plan enforces that exclusivity. A pilgrim would approach through the proneros, which is a front porch framed by the extending side walls and a row of columns.
And 9.
Passing through massive, heavy doors, they would look into the naos, or cella. This was the primary chamber. It was completely windowless. The only illumination came from the ambient light spilling through the open front doors or the flickering of oil lamps.
It must have been incredibly atmospheric.
Very dim, very smoky. And at the far end of this room stood the towering cult statue, often constructed of gold and ivory over wooden armature.
And some of the larger temples featured something called an adyton. What was that?
The adyton was a heavily restricted inner sanctum, usually located at the very back of the cella. It was utilized for oracular consultations or highly secretive mystery cult initiations.
Furthermore, the overall orientation of the temple was strictly calculated.
Oh, absolutely. The vast majority of Greek temples were aligned astronomically along an east-west axis. The entrance faced east.
Was there a specific reason for facing east?
Yes. This was designed so that on specific festival days, the light of the rising sun would travel directly through the open front doors and dramatically illuminate the face of the cult statue in the darkness.
It's the integration of astronomy, the natural environment, and architectural mass. And the sources note this reflects Pythagorean ideals.
Right. The Pythagoreans believed the universe was structured upon strict numerical ratios and musical harmonies. Greek architects applied these exact principles, a concept they called symmetria, to their blueprints.
They wanted the math to reflect the universe.
They desired the temple to be a physical microcosm of universal order. Every dimension, from the diameter of the column to the height of the roof, was mathematically proportional to every other element in the building.
If we compare two wildly different examples, we can really see how this philosophy evolved over time. Let's look at the Parthenon in Athens, completed around 432 BCE. It's the apex of the classical Doric order.
It features a peristyle of 46 outer columns. It utilizes every optical refinement we just discussed. It achieves a balanced, human-scaled harmony. It is massive, but it does not feel oppressive.
But if we move forward a century and a half into the Hellenistic period, The architectural goals shift dramatically.
They do. After the conquests of Alexander the Great, the wealth and scope of the Greek world expanded, and the architecture shifted toward overwhelming grandiosity and theatricality.
In the Hellenistic Temple of Apollo at Didyma, located on the coast of modern Turkey, is the perfect contrast here. Didyma is built on a scale that almost defies comprehension.
The architects at Didyma attempted absolute gigantism. Begun around 300 BCE, it was an Ionic structure measuring over 109 meters in length. It was completely surrounded by a dense forest of columns, a double row forming a dipteral colonnade.
How many columns are we talking about?
There were 122 columns in total, each towering over 19 meters high.
That's a skyscraper made of marble.
It is. But the most radical departure was the interior. Unlike the Parthenon, the center of Didyma was not a roofed, dark room. It was a massive, open-air, interior courtyard.
And you didn't just walk through front doors to get there.
No, to reach it, visitors had to navigate through dark, descending, barrel-vaulted, underground stone tunnels.
So you were plunging into the dark earth before emerging into the light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You emerge from those dark tunnels into a blindingly bright, sunlit inner courtyard that contained a sacred spring and a smaller secondary shrine enclosing the cult statue. It was architecture designed purely for dramatic, psychological manipulation.
I want to examine a completely different function of these buildings, though. We talk about temples as spiritual dwellings, but the amount of physical wealth concentrated in these structures was astronomical. If the cella was just a room for a statue, why build the walls so thick? Why surround it with heavy stone and bronze grills?
It's a great question.
Yeah, it seems like these temples functioned almost as ancient Federal Reserve banks.
That is a highly accurate assessment of their civic utility. In the ancient Greek world, the religious and the economic spheres were entirely inseparable.
They were one and the same.
Yes. The back porch of the temple, the opisthodomos, which was usually walled off from the main cella, frequently served as a highly secure treasury vault. When city-states signed treaties, won wars, or when wealthy individuals sought favor from the gods, they deposited votive offerings at the sanctuary.
And over generations, these sanctuaries just accumulated incomprehensible hordes of wealth.
We are talking about solid gold statues, tons of silver bullion, intricately carved ivory, and millions of silver coins. They were hoarding the gross domestic product of entire regions inside a stone box.
Sanctuaries like Delphi or the Acropolis in Athens essentially functioned as central economic hubs.
They did. The priests and civic treasurers managed this capital. They would frequently loan the temple funds out at interest to finance massive public works projects, fund naval fleets, or sustain prolonged military campaigns.
So the physical mass of the temple, the meter-thick stone walls, the massive reinforced bronze doors, the heavy iron grills blocking the porches, these were not merely aesthetic choices to convey gravity.
Not at all. They were high-security measures engineered to protect the hard currency reserves of the civilization.
Okay, but storing the wealth of an empire inside a highly rigid stone building presents a massive physical risk because Greece is situated on a highly active tectonic fault line.
The earth is constantly shaking.
Right. Putting tens of thousands of tons of brittle stone directly on top of each other in an earthquake zone seems like a recipe for a catastrophic collapse. How did these structures survive the constant tremors?
The survival of these temples is a testament to one of the most brilliant aspects of Greek engineering. As we established earlier, they relied exclusively on the post and lintel structural system, vertical columns supporting horizontal beams.
They actively avoided using true load-bearing arches in their classical temple architecture.
Yes, to maintain that aesthetic purity. But more importantly for earthquakes, they utilized dry stone masonry. They did not use mortar, cement, or any kind of glue to bind the blocks together.
A completely dry stack of stone blocks just sounds like a child's tower of wooden blocks. The second you shake the table, the entire thing should topple over.
It seems completely counterintuitive to a modern observer because modern seismic engineering relies heavily on ductility.
Explain ductility for us.
Ductility is the ability of a material to deform under tensile stress. If you observe a skyscraper built today from steel and reinforced concrete during an earthquake, the building is designed to flex, bend, and sway. The materials themselves stretch to absorb the kinetic energy of the seismic waves.
But solid marble and limestone possess zero ductility.
Exactly. They are incredibly brittle materials. If you mortar a solid marble wall together and try to make it bend during an earthquake, the sheer force will simply snap the rigid stone and the entire wall will shatter and collapse.
So if the stone cannot bend to absorb the energy, What is the mechanical solution here?
The ancient builders engineered an articulated structural system. Because the blocks were carved with such extreme hair-width precision, they fit together with absolute airtight contact.
But they did join them somehow, right? Just not with mortar?
Right. To maintain the alignment of the structure, they joined adjacent blocks horizontally and vertically using metal clamps and dowels, usually forged from iron or bronze, but the critical engineering genius lies in the seating of those clamps.
What did they do?
They carved a groove in the stone, placed the iron clamp inside, and then poured molten lead into the void, completely encasing the iron.
Now, the primary function of the lead is usually cited as rust prevention, right? It seals the iron so moisture cannot cause it to oxidize and expand, which would slowly split the stone from the inside.
Rust prevention is the chemical benefit, certainly, but the mechanical benefit is far more important for seismic survival. Lead is a soft, malleable metal.
So it absorbs the shock.
Precisely. When an earthquake strikes, the lead casing acts as a microshock absorber. It allows the dry, unmortared joints between the massive blocks to move just a fraction of a millimeter. The building doesn't attempt to resist the earthquake by flexing. It survives through external energy absorption mechanisms.
Let's spend a minute unpacking that because it's a huge concept. If you think about the human spine, it's not one solid bone. It is a stack of individual vertebrae separated by flexible discs.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
If you jump off a wall, the impact is absorbed because all those individual joints compress and shift slightly. If your spine was one solid fused bone, the impact would just snap it in half.
That is an excellent biomechanical analogy for the Greek temple. The energy of the earthquake is dissipated through the friction of movement. As the seismic waves roll through the bedrock, the hundreds of individual heavy blocks comprising the temple slide against each other horizontally.
They rotate slightly.
Yes. The massive multi-drum columns actually rock back and forth on their bases, opening and closing at the joints. The entire mass of the building essentially dances.
Dancing stone.
Exactly. The intense friction generated by all those heavy, unglued stones grinding against one another absorbs and disperses the destructive kinetic energy before the brittle marble reaches its breaking point.
The theoretical mechanics of this were proven by a highly specific seismic study conducted in 1990 by an engineer named C.L. Papantonopoulos. The study focused on the temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassae, which we mentioned earlier regarding that hidden Corinthian capital.
The Papantonopoulos study fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient structural dynamics.
The research team deployed 4 digital accelerographs, right?
Yes. These are highly sensitive instruments designed to measure exactly how much and how violently a specific point on a structure moves during a seismic event.
And they strategically placed these 4 sensors across the temple. One was anchored directly into the natural bedrock foundation beneath the temple. The second was placed on the stylobate, the top step of the platform.
The third was positioned high up on the horizontal architrave beam, and the fourth was placed directly on top of one of the column capitals.
Over the course of a year, the array captured data from 4 distinct natural earthquakes, ranging in magnitude from a mild 3.0 up to a significant 5.1.
And the data retrieved from those sensors provided a perfect mechanical autopsy of the building's response. By comparing the acceleration recorded at the bedrock level to the acceleration recorded at the top of the columns, the researchers calculated what's called the horizontal amplification factor.
The resulting data points are astonishing. The numbers demonstrated that while the bedrock moved with the earthquake, the top of the column experienced massive acceleration amplification.
It was whipping back and forth horizontally 2, 3, or sometimes 4 times as violently as the bedrock below it.
And the vertical amplification was even more extreme. The sensors recorded vertical acceleration at the capital up to 12 times greater than the movement of the Earth.
This empirical data proved definitively that the structure was operating as a fully articulated friction-based system. It was not resisting the quake as a rigid monolithic block.
So the bedrock moved, the foundation moved with it, and that kinetic energy traveled upward through the columns.
Right. And because the columns were built of stacked drums without mortar, the joints opened, the drums rocked and shifted, amplifying the speed of the movement at the top, but critically dissipating the destructive force through friction.
They literally turned gravity and the crushing mass of the stone into a defensive mechanism. They engineered a building where the joints are designed to fail just enough to save the overall structure.
It's a profound application of high-level physics.
And this mathematical problem-solving approach to managing space and forces was not isolated to individual temples. As the civilization evolved, Greek planners began to apply this exact same logic of structured, rational order to the macro level, the layout of entire cities.
This macro application of order brings us to the 5th century BCE and the work of Hippodamus of Miletus. He's a figure frequently cited as the father of urban planning.
The sources are very clear, though, that Hippodamus did not invent the grid plan.
No, he didn't.
The orthogonal layout streets, intersecting at perfect right angles to create a checkerboard of rectangular blocks, had precedence in the Near East and in much earlier Greek colonial settlements in Sicily, such as Megara Hyblaea, which was built centuries before Hippodamus was even active.
It's a common misconception that he invented the geometry of the grid. His true contribution was theoretical and political. Hippodamus was the first known thinker to explicitly fuse physical urban planning with social and political philosophy.
He operated as a political theorist who viewed architecture as a tool for social engineering.
He hypothesized that a chaotic, organically grown, winding, unplanned city inherently fostered a chaotic and unequal citizenry. He believed that the physical layout of the streets must rigidly enforce and reflect the political structure of the society residing within it.
So he essentially weaponized the grid for a philosophical purpose.
He utilized the grid to physically divide the urban environment into strict, rationally defined functional zones. He designated specific sectors purely as sacred space for the sanctuaries, public space for civic administration and commerce, and private space for residential housing.
But more importantly, the grid was a mechanism to enforce something called isonomia.
Isonomia is the fundamental democratic concept of equality of political rights. By surveying and laying out perfectly identical, standardized rectangular blocks for housing, the state physically ensured that land, which was the primary source of wealth and status, was distributed equally among the voting citizens.
So a democratic society required a physically democratic distribution of space.
Exactly.
The physical reality of this philosophy is highly visible at Piraeus, the vital port city of Athens, which Hippodamus was personally commissioned to redesign. Archaeologists excavating Piraeus have uncovered literal stone boundary markers.
And those stones are carved with explicit inscriptions dictating exactly where a public administrative zone ended and the private residential zone began.
The polis was treating the physical space of the city as a strictly managed, highly regulated civic resource.
The manifestation of this ideal is even more striking at the city of Olynthus in northern Greece, constructed around 400 BCE. Excavations of the residential districts at Olynthus reveal a flawless, rigid, orthogonal grid.
It looks like a modern suburban development on a map.
It does. The residential blocks are laid out with mathematical uniformity, and the individual houses built within those blocks share the exact same footprint and internal layout. They share party walls and identical drainage allers.
It is the physical manifestation of the democratic ideal, forcibly stamped onto the landscape by the authority of the state.
Within this heavily regulated civic grid, the public life of the citizens played out in highly specialized architectural spaces. We've mentioned the agora, the central open plaza used for markets and massive gatherings.
But the structures framing the agora were just as vital to the functioning of the city. Let's talk about the stoa.
The stoa is a profoundly Greek architectural form. In its simplest definition, it is a long, covered portico or colonnaded walkway.
Structurally, it generally consists of a solid masonry wall at the rear, often partitioned into small individual rooms that served as shops, taverns, or administrative offices, and a long row of columns opening outward toward the agora in the front.
The Stoa of Attalos in the Athenian agora is a prime reconstructed example of this.
They basically function as the connective tissue of public life.
They provided vital shelter. The Mediterranean sun is relentless in the summer, and as we said, the winter brings heavy rains. The Stoa offered a shaded, ventilated year-round space where merchants could trade, politicians could canvass for votes, and philosophers could pace and teach.
Like the Stoics, who literally took their name from the building.
Exactly. As the city-states grew wealthier in the Hellenistic period, the engineering of these stoas became increasingly sophisticated. For instance, in the Stoa of Philip on the island of Samothrace, structural engineers integrated a concealed flat arch hidden entirely within the entablature.
What did that allow them to do?
It distributed the massive load of the roof much more efficiently than a standard horizontal beam. This allowed them to space the front columns much wider apart, opening up the facade without risking a structural collapse.
So their dedication to the traditional visual aesthetic didn't stop them from innovating structurally behind the facade.
Not at all.
Another crucial public structure integrated into the civic fabric was the theater. But the Greek theater was not a freestanding, enclosed building in the center of the grid like a modern cinema.
No, they carved these structures directly into the natural topography. They utilized steep hillsides to support the semicircular tiered seating, the cavea, which looked down upon a flat, circular performance space called the orchestra.
The engineering applied to these open-air theaters is astounding, particularly regarding the physics of sound. The Theater of Epidaurus, constructed in the 4th century BCE, remains the absolute masterpiece of ancient acoustic engineering.
The scale of Epidaurus is massive. It held up to 14,000 spectators.
Yet, if you stand dead center in the orchestra and speak in a normal conversational volume, your voice can be heard perfectly by a person sitting in the uppermost row of stone benches over 50 meters away and high up the hillside.
The acoustics are not an accident of the landscape either. They are the result of deliberate material science and complex geometry. The seating tiers at Epidaurus are constructed from a specific type of limestone.
How does the stone help the sound?
The corrugated, stepped physical profile of the limestone surface acts as a highly sophisticated acoustic filter. The dimensions of the steps naturally trap and absorb low-frequency background noises, the rustling of closing, the murmuring of 14,000 people, the wind,
while simultaneously reflecting high-frequency sound waves, like the voices of the actors, back upward toward the audience.
Exactly. Modern acoustic engineers have actually measured the performance of Epidaurus. The data shows an 80% speech intelligibility rate in the absolute back rows.
That level of acoustic clarity rivals and often surpasses complex modern concert halls equipped with electronic amplification.
Furthermore, the pitch of the seating is critical. The cavea at Epidaurus is pitched at a highly calculated 55-degree angle. This specific incline creates an acoustic bowl that minimizes reverberation and echo, directing the sound waves upward and outward with maximum physical efficiency.
They were manipulating acoustic physics on a massive scale in the 4th century BCE. And for a different type of public speaking, they engineered the bouleuterion.
The bouleuterion was the council house. It was the space where the elected representatives of the city met to debate and legislate.
Because the function was different, the architecture was different. Unlike the sprawling open-air theaters designed for dramatic projection, the bouleuterion was typically a smaller, fully roofed, enclosed rectangular building.
The seating was tightly arranged in a U-shape or a steep semicircle directly surrounding a central speaker's platform. The bouleuterion at the city of Priene is a phenomenal surviving example of this.
And this inward-facing, highly compressed acoustic design ensured that every single council member could hear the nuances of the debate and engage in rapid-fire dialogue.
The architecture was specifically designed to facilitate the speed and clarity required by the democratic legislative process.
The public spaces are magnificent, engineered for democracy, acoustic perfection, and aesthetic harmony. However, there is a glaring contradiction in the ancient city.
Yes.
While the public sphere was built of gleaming marble and sophisticated geometry, the average citizen lived in conditions that were starkly different. The streets in the older, organically developed residential neighborhoods of Athens were narrow, unpaved, prone to flooding, and frequently functioned as open sewers. There is a massive disconnect between the grandeur of the public wealth and the reality of private living conditions.
But that disconnect is intentional. It is a direct reflection of the core cultural values of the classical Greek polis. The prevailing societal ethos prioritized the public good, the state, and the civic identity far above private ambition, personal comfort, or domestic luxury.
The polis was the center of existence.
Consequently, immense resources, labor, and engineering brilliance were poured into the sanctuaries to honor the gods and into the civic structures where the communal life of the city transpired. For an individual citizen to build a lavish, ostentatious, private mansion using marble or complex engineering would be viewed as deeply anti-democratic.
It would be considered hubris.
Yes, an arrogant display of wealth that attempted to elevate the individual above the collective community.
So if we leave the marble-paved agora, walk down one of those narrow, unpaved streets, and step inside a residential block, what does the architecture of the private sphere reveal about their daily existence?
Domestic architecture revolved entirely around the concept of the oikos, a term that encompasses the physical household, the family unit, the property, and the enslaved staff. The physical fore of the oikos was the courtyard house.
And unlike the temples, these were built cheaply and practically.
The foundation usually consisted of a low socle, which is a base course made of rough rubble stone, designed solely to prevent ground moisture from wicking up into the walls. Above that stone base, the walls were constructed entirely of cheap, sun-dried mud bricks.
And the roofs were flat or gently sloped, framed with rough timber beams and packed thick with clay and thatch to shed water. The interior floors were rarely paved. They were typically just tightly compacted earth.
When visualizing a house, a modern person naturally assumes there are windows facing the street to let in light and provide a view. But the Greek house actively rejected the street.
The Greek oikos functioned essentially as a fortress turned inward against the city.
The exterior walls facing the public street were overwhelmingly blank and featureless. They might feature a heavy wooden door and perhaps a few tiny, narrow slits placed high up near the roofline for ventilation. But there were no large windows, no welcoming porches, no front yards.
Absolutely all of the life, the light, the ventilation, and the daily activity came from a single open-air central courtyard located deep in the middle of the structure.
So if you are sitting in your living room right now looking out a large front window at the street, you are violating a fundamental architectural rule of the ancient Greek home. They completely turned their backs on the public sphere once they crossed the threshold.
That inward-facing design was not merely for security, was it?
No, it was deeply intertwined with their rigid societal norms regarding privacy, control, and strict gender segregation. Space within the oikos was aggressively partitioned. The house was conceptually and physically divided into two highly distinct zones.
The first zone is the andron.
The andron was the men's dining room. It was an exclusive space utilized almost entirely for hosting symposia, those formalized male drinking parties, political gatherings, and philosophical debates.
And because the andron was the only space where outside guests were entertained, it was almost always located immediately adjacent to the main street entrance.
The placement at the front door is highly strategic. By placing the andron at the very front of the house, the master of the house ensured that male visitors from the city could enter, dine, and leave without ever having to walk through the interior courtyard or access the rest of the home.
So the architectural layout was designed specifically to prevent outside men from seeing, hearing, or interacting with the female members of the household.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which effectively isolates the second zone of the house, the gyneconitis.
The gyneconitis refers to the women's quarters. This area was typically located as deep within the architectural footprint as possible.
It was often situated at the very back of the interior courtyard, behind locked doors, or situated on a second floor accessible only by a single wooden staircase that could be easily monitored.
This was the domain where the women of the family lived, managed the domestic enslaved staff, raised the children, and performed vital economic labor.
The architecture physically enforced the prevailing philosophical ideology of the city-state. Women were expected to remain unseen by the public, sequestered safely within the private sphere.
The archaeological evidence backing this up is incredibly detailed, specifically from excavations at a site called Morgantina in Sicily, dating to the 3rd century BCE. When archaeologists excavated these middle-class courtyard houses, they found exactly how these deep interior spaces functioned.
The material culture recovered from Morgantina really illuminates the reality of the gyneconitis. In these secluded interior rooms, archaeologists uncovered massive, heavy volcanic rotary millstones used for hours of daily grain grinding.
They also found dense clusters of terracotta loom weights, indicating the presence of large, warp-weighted looms.
And the presence of the looms and millstones completely changes the perception of the house. The rest of the house was not just a series of quiet bedrooms. The oikos was a highly active, noisy, dusty microfactory.
Producing enough spun thread and woven cloth to clothe a family required thousands of hours of intense physical labor. Processing raw grain into edible flour using hand-cranked stones was back-breaking work.
And we must recognize who was performing the majority of that grueling labor. Slaves were absolutely integral to the economic survival of the oikos. The architecture reflects their presence, but minimizes their footprint.
Enslaved workers typically slept in tiny, unventilated cubicles adjacent to the kitchen or the work areas. Or they were relegated to cramped, sweltering attics tucked directly under the clay roof.
The courtyard house was not a relaxed domestic retreat. It was a rigidly structured hierarchy of bodies managed through locked doors, controlled sightlines, and segregated spaces.
Whether we are analyzing a modest mud brick courtyard house in Olympus or staring at a massive, mathematically perfect marble temple on the Acropolis, our modern visualization of these spaces is missing one massive, overwhelming sensory layer. When you look at a photograph of the Parthenon today, you see stark, bleached white stone.
But that image is fundamentally historically wrong.
The perception of the ancient world as a landscape of pure, unpainted white marble is arguably the greatest, most pervasive visual misconception in Western history. The myth of the white ruin is entirely false.
It really is. The myth stems from a massive historical misunderstanding during the Renaissance. When European antiquarians began digging up classical statues and architectural fragments from the dirt, the paint had largely washed away or degraded after centuries underground.
They looked at the bare, scrubbed stone and incorrectly assumed that the raw marble was the artist's intended finished product.
And that initial accident of preservation was later actively championed and weaponized as an ideological preference. By the 18th and 19th centuries, highly influential European art historians, men like Johann Joachim Winckelmann, had elevated the false aesthetic of unpainted white marble into a symbol of ultimate classical purity, rationality, and intellectual restraint.
And in some darker historical chapters, this preference for whiteness was even conflated with false notions of racial superiority.
They willfully ignored the extensive literary evidence from ancient authors who vividly described painted buildings, and they actively scrubbed away the faint traces of pigment that were still clearly visible on statues when they were pulled from the ground. They preferred their invented, sterile version of the past because it perfectly aligned with modern, minimalist sensibilities of what constituted high art.
But the scientific application of modern technology has completely obliterated that myth. The reality is that Greek architecture and sculpture were brilliantly, almost aggressively colorful. We have to look at the data from the Gods in Color exhibition.
That exhibition originated from research in 2003 and had a massive showing at the Liebig House in Frankfurt in 2008.
The researchers at the Liebig House didn't just guess what the colors were. They utilized highly advanced, non-destructive imaging techniques.
They scanned the surfaces of ancient marble statues and temple fragments using ultraviolet light, extreme raking light analysis to detect microscopic variations in the stone's weathering, and X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy.
Through these scans, they found the chemical ghosts of the paint. The stone physically weathered differently depending on which specific chemical pigment was painted over it, leaving a microscopic topographical map of the lost patterns.
And the pigments they identified were not subtle, muted pastels?
No, they utilized deeply saturated, highly expensive mineral pigments. The chemical signatures reveal the extensive use of ochre earths for vibrant yellows and deep browns.
They used copper carbonates, specifically azurite, to produce a deep, brilliant blue and malachite for intense, bright greens. For reds, they heavily utilized vermilion, derived from toxic cinnabar, which produces an intense blood red hue.
They weren't just grinding up rocks either. The chemical analysis shows they were manufacturing synthetic pigments, like Egyptian blue, through complex, high-temperature firing processes.
And to bind all these raw mineral powders to the smooth marble, they didn't use oil paint. They utilized tempera techniques.
The raw pigment powders were mixed with organic binders to create a durable, adhesive paint. They used egg yolks, casein proteins extracted from milk, or sometimes heated waxes in a technique called encaustic.
When you apply these mineral pigments using a tempera binder, the resulting color is completely opaque, matte, and incredibly saturated. It doesn't look like a light wash or a watercolor. It looks like a thick, solid shell of brilliant color coating the stone.
When you look at the physical full-color reconstructions produced by the Liebig House team based on the UV data, it is a complete shock to the system. The friezes, the triglyphs, the capitals of the Parthenon were not white.
They were blanketed in intricate, tightly woven geometric meander patterns, alternating in blocks of blindingly bright blue, red, and gold leaf.
The pedamental sculptures, the massive gods fighting in the triangles of the roof, had painted, staring eyes. Their marble clothing was painted with complex, multicolored textile patterns mimicking real woven fabric.
They had physical bronze attachments for spears, horse bridles, and jewelry that would catch the sun and gleam. A classical Greek temple, newly finished, must have looked like a massive, blindingly colorful jewel resting on the peak of the Acropolis, visible from miles out at sea.
It fundamentally changes the sensory reality of the ancient city. It was not a quiet landscape of austere, silent ghosts. It was visually loud, intensely bright, and pulsing with complex information.
The application of color was not merely decorative whimsy. The architects used high-contrast colors to visually separate the structural elements of the building, making the complex mechanics of the entablature readable from the ground, and to bring the mythological narratives in the pediments crashing vividly into reality.
The realization of this vibrant polychrony forces a total paradigm shift in how we evaluate classical antiquity. It demands that we reconsider every assumption we have made about their aesthetic values.
The Greeks built dynamic, highly engineered machines. They constructed structures with unmortared lead-cased joints specifically calculated to move, flex, and dance with the heaving earth.
They theorized and deployed rigid city grids as active political instruments to force social equality and dictate the mechanics of democratic participation.
They carefully tweaked the geometry of massive stones to manipulate the flawed human eye, and they coated their cities in brilliant, aggressive color. They were not just building passive shelters, they were engineering active tools for survival and civic control.
The classical world was highly calculated, deeply colorful, and in constant deliberate motion. If we look closely at the engineering that allowed a stone temple to survive a magnitude 5 earthquake, we have to recognize that this high-level grasp of physics was applied everywhere.
We see the exact same mathematical brilliance applied to their water management. Consider the Eupolinian aqueduct on the island of Samos, constructed in the 6th century BCE.
They dug a massive tunnel straight through a solid mountain to bring water to the city.
But the engineering marvel is that they started digging from both sides of the mountain simultaneously. They utilized advanced geometry to ensure the two tunnels met perfectly in the exact center of the solid rock, dropping at a precise gradient the entire way to keep the water flowing.
Or consider the massive naval ship sheds at Taraeus, engineered to haul multi-ton warships out of the water to dry the hulls, relying on complex slipways and friction management.
The architecture we see today, the temples, the stoas, is merely the surviving skeletal exterior of a civilization that was operating as a massive, integrated physics and engineering laboratory.
It forces you to look at our own modern cities differently. Our contemporary architectural aesthetic, the deep love for minimalist, unpainted concrete, exposed steel, and stark, sterile white walls, is heavily influenced by what we thought the classical world looked like. But that foundation is based on a complete misunderstanding of the vibrant antiquity we claim to revere. It makes you wonder, what else about the past have we completely whitewashed simply because it did not fit our modern sensibilities?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.